The first complaint seemed small, almost like gossip. A mother swore her baby's eyes were the wrong color. Another said her newborn's hair didn't match anyone in the family. Nurses whispered that new parents were just overwhelmed, seeing things through the haze of sleepless nights. But as months turned to years, strange questions began surfacing in the same small-town hospital. Children grew into toddlers who looked nothing like their parents. Some had medical conditions that didn't match their family histories. A few even carried blood types that made no genetic sense. At first, doctors dismissed it all as coincidence. DNA testing wasn't common, and few families had the resources or courage to challenge a hospital they trusted. But then came the breaking point. A court case where a couple sued for custody after discovering through a rare blood test that the baby they had raised for 5 years wasn't theirs. The scandal cracked open a nightmare nobody was prepared for. Investigators dug into the hospital's maternity ward records, and what they found was staggering. Dozens of birth certificates, charts, and wristband logs had been quietly altered, sometimes by a single stroke of a pen. Entire families had been torn apart before they even began. At the center of it all was one nurse. Her name was Helen Morris. To her colleagues, she was efficient, professional, and quiet. To patients, she was kind, always smiling as she placed newborns into their mother's arms. No one suspected that behind her calm, gentle face hid a hunger for cruelty unlike anything they had ever seen. When police finally confronted her, she admitted it without hesitation. She had swapped at least 36 babies at birth, intentionally, methodically, just to watch families unravel years later. She didn't do it for money, or revenge, or power. She did it, she said, because she liked to watch people suffer. And as the horrifying truth spread across the town, families began asking themselves the same terrifying question. Was the child sleeping in their home really theirs at all? Helen Morris had been a nurse for nearly 20 years. On the surface, she was the kind of employee every hospital wanted, never late, rarely called in sick, always volunteering for the hardest shifts. She blended into the background, the quiet woman in crisp scrubs who rarely raised her voice and never made mistakes on paper. To new parents, she was a reassuring presence, gently placing babies into arms, offering words of comfort, and reminding them that their child was safe. But behind closed doors, Helen was different. Colleagues noticed she had no close friends, no family visiting her, no photographs in her locker. She lived alone in a drab apartment, kept to herself and avoided personal questions. Nurses whispered that she was odd, but in a profession where exhaustion and eccentricity were common, no one looked too closely. Her obsession began slowly. She admitted later that the first swap had been an accident. 2 babies born minutes apart, their name tags misplaced in the chaos of a busy night. Instead of correcting it, she let the mistake stand. Months later, when she overheard the families fighting over how little the child resembled them, something inside her clicked. She liked it. The confusion, the doubt, the cracks forming in what should have been joyful homes. After that, it was no longer an accident. It became a game. She would deliberately switch wristbands, alter records, and carefully trade one infant for another. Sometimes she chose babies from families of different races, just to make the cruelty more obvious later. Other times she selected families she disliked, parents who complained too much, or who she thought didn't deserve happiness. But more often than not, she swapped babies at random, enjoying the chaos that would bloom years down the line. By her own twisted logic, she wasn't killing anyone. She wasn't stealing or harming the infants physically. In her mind, she was conducting a kind of experiment, social surgery, she once called it. Watching as trust eroded, as marriages collapsed, as parents questioned whether they could even love a child who wasn't theirs by blood. Some of the victims spoke years later about how the damage rippled through their lives. One father said his wife never forgave him for doubting the paternity of their child. Another woman recalled growing up feeling like a stranger in her own home, always hearing whispers that she didn't belong. Families were destroyed, not overnight, but slowly, painfully, like a cancer eating away at love itself. And through it all, Helen kept smiling, handing babies to mothers with hands that looked so gentle, hiding the cruelest secret the town had ever known. What no one realized was that the swaps weren't just reckless acts of cruelty. They were carefully documented in a private journal she kept hidden in her apartment. In those pages, investigators would later find a chilling record of every switch, each baby numbered, each family described in detail as if she were cataloging her own private experiment in human suffering. The investigation exploded once the journal was found. Detectives had entered Helen's apartment expecting to find maybe some scattered notes, maybe photographs, but what they discovered was a meticulous ledger spanning nearly 2 decades. On the first page, in neat handwriting, she had written, "The beginning of my little project." Inside were 36 entries. Each one listed the date of birth, the names of the parents, and the changes she had made to the charts. Next to them were her cold, clinical observations. Mother overly emotional. Let's see how she reacts in 5 years. Or, father suspicious of paternity already. This should finish him. Some entries even included predictions. Marriage won't last. Child will feel like an outsider. Perfect. The detail was staggering. She had remembered every switch, every moment, and cataloged it like a scientist running experiments in human suffering. Some of the entries were accompanied by small sketches, crude drawings of crying infants with arrows pointing to different homes, as if she was proud of what she had done, as if she believed her cruelty deserved to be recorded for posterity. When detectives brought the evidence to the district attorney, jaws dropped. This wasn't just negligence or incompetence, it was deliberate, systematic sabotage of families at their most vulnerable. But proving it in court meant tearing open wounds in the community. Dozens of families would have to undergo DNA testing, some of them with children now in their teens. Parents who had spent years raising sons and daughters would have to face the possibility that their child wasn't theirs at all. The hospital became a war zone of panic and outrage. Mothers stormed the maternity ward demanding answers. Fathers shouted in waiting rooms. Lawsuits piled up by the dozens. Reporters camped outside the building, shoving microphones into every doctor's face, asking how something so monstrous could have gone unnoticed for so long. For the families, the results were devastating. One by one, DNA tests confirmed what the journal had already spelled out. Children discovered they had been raised by strangers. Parents realized the baby they had held in their arms that first night had been stolen and replaced by someone else's. Siblings learned they weren't truly related by blood. The fallout was brutal. Some families exchanged children after the truth was revealed, awkwardly trying to reconnect with the sons and daughters they had been denied. Others refused, insisting love mattered more than biology. Court battles erupted between biological parents and the parents who had raised the children for years. The town became a battlefield of grief, betrayal, and rage. And through it all, Helen Morris sat in a holding cell, calm and silent, watching the chaos unfold on the news. When a detective asked if she felt remorse, she gave a chilling answer. Remorse? No. I gave them stories. Without me, they'd just live boring little lives. Now, they'll never forget. It was in that moment investigators realized they weren't just dealing with a cruel nurse. They were dealing with someone who saw herself as an architect of suffering, a woman who believed her cruelty was a kind of art. Court was standing room only the day Helen Morris appeared in shackles. The quiet, mousy nurse who once slipped unnoticed through hospital hallways now sat under glaring lights, her thin frame swallowed by a prison jumpsuit. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and the families whose lives she had ripped apart filled every bench, their faces twisted with rage and grief. The prosecution laid out the evidence like a nightmare on display. They read entries from her journal aloud, her writing projected on a massive screen for the jury to see. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as parents recognized their own names in her cruel notes.
Father already doubts this is his child. A swap will guarantee collapse. A mother sobbed uncontrollably when her family's entry was revealed. Baby number 22. replaced with couple who can't have more children. They'll cling to her, even if she doesn't resemble them. Delicious. One by one, families were called to the stand. A father told the jury how he spent 10 years believing his daughter wasn't his, drinking himself to the edge of ruin, only to discover after DNA testing that his instincts had been right. She wasn't his child, she had been stolen from him. A mother described the agony of learning that the boy she had raised as her own flesh and blood belonged biologically to another woman who now wanted him back. Teenagers wept on the stand, describing how they no longer knew who they were. "If my parents aren't my parents, then who am I?" one girl asked through tears. The defense tried to argue mental illness. They painted Helen as a lonely, isolated woman who had lost touch with reality, who was obsessed with control because she had no family of her own. But prosecutors countered with chilling evidence. Helen had been completely aware of her actions. Her notes weren't ramblings. They were deliberate, organized, and filled with pleasure at the suffering she caused. And then came the twist that froze the room. Investigators revealed Helen had not stopped at 36 babies. In her final journal entry, dated just weeks before her arrest, she wrote, "It's only fun when no one knows. Once they catch me, I'll be famous. My name will live forever." She had been waiting to be discovered. Every note, every meticulous detail was not just a private obsession, but a blueprint for notoriety. She had wanted this, her name in headlines, her face on screens, her legacy cemented in the ruin of families who would never heal. As her words were read aloud, Helen smiled for the first time during the trial. It wasn't wide or dramatic. It was small, sharp, and utterly chilling. A smile that seemed to say she had gotten exactly what she wanted. Parents screamed from the gallery. One man had to be restrained after trying to lunge at her. The judge slammed his gavel until the room quieted, but the tension never left. Everyone understood now. Helen Morris hadn't just swapped babies. She had played God with 36 lives, and she was proud of it. The trial was no longer about whether she was guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. It was about whether justice could ever be enough for the kind of damage she had done. The sentencing hearings dragged on for weeks, each day more emotional than the last. Victims' families lined up to give impact statements, their voices cracking as they spoke directly to the woman who had stolen their lives. Some begged the judge for the harshest punishment possible. Others simply broke down, unable to speak through their sobs. One mother clutched a photo of the baby she had lost at birth, the child she never got to raise. She held it up in court, trembling, and shouted at Helen, "You robbed me of my daughter. You robbed her of me. You destroyed everything." The entire courtroom wept, except for Helen, who sat still, her lips pursed, her eyes gleaming with something disturbingly close to satisfaction. The prosecution pushed for the maximum penalty, multiple life sentences. They emphasized the deliberate nature of her crimes, the decades of cruelty, the journal that read like the diary of a sadist. This was not negligence. This was not a mistake. This was a campaign of destruction, orchestrated by a woman who wanted to watch the world burn from the shadows of a maternity ward. When it was her turn to speak, Helen shocked the room again. Rising slowly, shackles clinking, she leaned toward the microphone and spoke in a calm, almost cheerful voice. "You all act like I killed them, but I didn't kill anyone. I gave them homes. I gave them stories. Some of those children are happier than they would have been. You should be thanking me." The gallery erupted. Parents screamed, others sobbed, and one man fainted. The judge pounded the gavel so hard it echoed like thunder. But Helen didn't flinch. She smirked, enjoying every second of the chaos. When the sentence was finally read, the room held its breath. Helen Morris was given 36 consecutive life sentences, one for each child she had swapped, ensuring she would never walk free again. The judge's words were cold and final. You played God with innocent lives. You will spend the rest of your days behind bars, forgotten by the world you wanted to control. But if the judge thought his words would break her, he was wrong. Helen tilted her head, smiled faintly, and whispered, "Forgotten? No, they'll never forget me." And in a way, she was right. The damage she had caused could never be undone. Families were forever fractured. Children carried scars of identity that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Some parents refused to give up the children they had raised, leading to bitter custody battles that stretched on for years. Others tried to rebuild with their biological children, but trust and connection came too late. Even those untouched by the swaps lived in fear. Every new mother in town stared at her newborn with doubt. Every father wondered if the baby in his arms truly carried his blood. Hospitals across the country were forced to tighten security, installing cameras and implementing DNA testing at birth to restore even a fraction of the trust that Helen had obliterated. The world moved on, but the shadow of Helen Morris lingered. She had wanted to be remembered, and with every broken family, every tear shed in that courtroom, her wish had already come true. Years passed, but the scars Helen Morris left behind only deepened. The children she had switched were no longer infants. They were teenagers and young adults, living with the knowledge that their lives had been stolen before they even began. Some tried to reconnect with their biological families, but the bonds felt forced, like strangers pretending to be kin. Others refused entirely, clinging to the only parents they had ever known, even if DNA said otherwise. The ripple effect spread endlessly. Family trees splintered, traditions shattered, and trust dissolved. For many, birthdays became painful reminders. Mothers who once celebrated with cakes and balloons now cried quietly, mourning the children they should have been raising. Fathers admitted they never looked at their kids the same way after the truth came out, even if they tried to love them as before. One boy told a reporter, "I feel like I was stolen twice, first by her, and then again when they told me I didn't belong." Inside prison, Helen thrived on the infamy. She gave interviews to journalists, answering questions with eerie calm. When asked why she did it, she always gave the same chilling reply: "Because I could, because nobody stopped me." She boasted that the system was so blind, so trusting, that she had been able to play with lives for nearly 20 years without suspicion. She even described her actions as art, calling herself the painter of chaos. Other inmates despised her. Some refused to speak her name, others spat in her food trays. But Helen never seemed rattled. In fact, guards reported that she smiled whenever she saw her story on television, as if she was proud of the devastation replayed in documentaries and news specials. She didn't see herself as a monster. She saw herself as unforgettable. The families, however, were left with pieces that never fit together again. Support groups formed, with parents and children gathering to cry, share stories, and try to make sense of lives derailed by a stranger in scrubs. Therapists warned that the trauma would likely pass through generations. How do you explain to a child that the person they call mom or dad isn't theirs, not because of fate, but because of cruelty? On the 10th anniversary of Helen's arrest, a memorial was held in the town square. 36 candles were lit, one for each stolen life. Parents held hands with the children they had raised, and sometimes with the children they had only recently found. The ceremony wasn't about forgiveness, it was about acknowledgement, a way of saying, "This happened, it broke us, but we are still here." Helen Morris never apologized. In her final interview before